Good day, Brigade! This is Bobby, and yes, you are hearing correctly. We are in fact back from our hiatus for a third season. So this season we're going to be covering quite a bit. We're going to be covering a lot more of the minor political things and the things that are lesser known, because at least based on your listenership, we're picking up that's more of what you guys want to hear. You want to hear something outside of A or B, and honestly, that's kind of what we tried to focus on initially. So we're going to be jumping back in that. In fact, this current episode's actually going to be more of a criticism on the other side of the aisle that we don't normally throw out. We're not going to be hitting the Republicans this time around, we're going to be hitting Democrats, and if you don't think we got something to say about them, oh boy, stay tuned. Anyways, during that hiatus, we got a lot of personal projects done. We hope that you did too, and, well, without further ado, here we go. So, there's been this bit of a mentality through, Reddit and a lot of places, in particular one I've been seeing on the subreddit political memes, where people of the Democratic tendency of the party tend to be showing memes depicting independents, not necessarily agreeing with them, automatically being in support of Republicans. This is fucking wrong. I can see the logic behind, oh hey, if independents aren't voting for us, they're essentially giving a vote to Republicans. And we see the logic behind that. We really do. Here's the problem with this. And oh my god, there's a long list, so buckle up, boys. And gals. Anywho, some of the big ol' results against Dems being the, quote, good guys and essentially portraying independents as accomplices to evil. First and foremost, Democrats, you do like to throw around a lot of words and a lot of nice sounding and great promises. You want to promote civil rights, you want to help reduce inflation, you want to bring things to be more equitable. All these are great and nice and good. Unfortunately, the results more often than not tend to be quite lacking. We're not even going to take a social issue here, we're going to take just an economic issue, quite simple. You remember the Inflation Reduction Act. At least I'd hope many of you would, since it wasn't too long ago that it was passed. Anywho, in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, how much inflation reduction has actually occurred? Well, looking at charts and all that, there has been some reduction. There's no argument there. However, the lowering of prices hasn't quite translated. Now, you can make the obvious argument, and quite frankly, we're not going to wholly disagree with this argument, that many of these challenges and actions have been taken on by corporate interests and Republican counters, and honestly, that's been pushing them hard. And yes, we get it. In a political sense, that does pose a little bit of a challenge. However, it's all fine to try and do good, but without some sort of follow-through, or pushing, or persistence, or insistence, or God forbid, putting your damn foot down, all you're essentially doing is paying lip service. You're not actually putting forth something to change. Now, you may argue, well, the greed of corporate interests. Fine, I get that. But there are ways you can act to counter these corporate interests. Like maybe do some investigations. Why are prices still so high? What can we do to help lower them? Have we done anything to help expand and promote trade lately? Or have we kept other policies in place that maybe shouldn't be? These are all things to consider, and quite frankly, it's what leads us to believe, yeah, there's words aplenty, but the results overall are lacking. How much true, genuine police reform has occurred on the federal level? Ever since George Floyd killing? A little bit. But let's be frank, it's been lip service, and any real change that's occurred has occurred on the local and state level. Now again, there is a reasonable argument to this. It's that police enforcement and such is something that is a local and state and county issue. It's not something the federal government can deal with entirely. Well, you actually can. Like perhaps putting some sort of standardization for police offices to follow. Maybe have something for officers to learn. Maybe have a core curriculum that every goddamn police officer in the United States should go through. Maybe enforce that there should be a universal form of education level. Like, maybe they have to have a bachelor's degree, bare minimum, in criminal justice. See, there are things that can be done. But if you don't follow through, then all you do is pay lip service. And lip service can get you votes for a while, but eventually real change has to occur and real follow-through has to result. Or you get people like me who are going to be like, okay, nice words, but show me the money. Our second good old argument on this one. It's a rather interesting one, but it kind of follows through onto this. Hey, look, follow through. But anyways, there seems to be this overall thought or rhetorical concept that seems to pervade through the Democratic Party. An idea of, they're wrong. We're not actually going to change a whole lot, but they're wrong. Now you might be wondering, what are you talking about? The Democratic Party platform is very different from the Republican Party. And again, in theory, you're right. But in practice, let's take a look. For example, President Biden has certainly talked a big game about undoing a lot of the trumpet policies. And he has done some, but, and yes, the big B word, what have you done totally? Going back to the trade policies we were talking about earlier, you've kept many of the Trump-era policies in. A lot, in fact. And again, we see why you might be doing that. You're trying to push away from China, and a lot of our trade policies that changed were with China. But what have you done to improve things out of that? What have you done to help improve our trade situation and our overall deal? Well, that's a very good question. Do you know? Because I've looked it up, and as far as I can tell, there ain't a whole hell of a lot. Don't get me wrong, we have definitely done some stuff. Like, for example, we have promoted the idea of producing chips within the United States, domestically. Now, fascinating idea, right? You could argue quite reasonably that limiting and reducing this trade with China will help us stay competitive and bolster our own production. But, a little bit of a problem with this. First and foremost, and this is a very good question to ask, do we have the labor with the skill in order to produce chips? Now, many of you might be thinking, does that really matter? And it's like, yes. Yes, it does. It's all well and good to talk about chip production and boosting our domestic production of various items, especially computer chips, a very high demand thing from China. But you need to ask, is the labor skill here? Because if it's not, how are you going to make those chips? Second problem with this, is it economically reasonable, or can we find another trade partner who can produce it at a lower cost than we can? Now, inevitably, costs will rise for the price of a chip as American labor is much more expensive than many other labor markets around the world. This is actually a large part of the reason why we had many trade policies with China, because a lot of their production was really cheap. Was it justified in being that cheap? Certainly not. But was it cheap? Yeah. And that's part of the reason why a lot of these producers went overseas, so that they can have a cheaper labor, produce a cheaper chip, and sell it at a cheaper price. So that way, your computer that you use for gaming doesn't cost $10,000, it only costs you $2,000. My God, have you ever tried to buy a gaming computer? They're insane. Large part, you gotta build it yourself. Not really here or there, but kinda calls back to the idea. Third problem we count into this. Do we have a way to deal with the diplomatic fallout that will inevitably result? Now you might be wondering, what diplomatic fallout? Hasn't China always been an enemy? It's complicated. So, a big part of the reason why we had those trade relations, and really any relations with China, actually comes from Tricky Dick Nixon himself, and his opening of trade relations with China. Now, you might be wondering, why in the hell did he do that? Well, because China and Russia in the 60s were undergoing this thing called the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split was a disagreement in ideas and ideology between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. Nixon saw this as an opportunity to jump into the People's Republic of China, which, during World War II, we actually helped the Chinese people fight off the Japanese, which gave us a bit of an in. And, well, the reason Nixon did that was quite simple. Keep China away from Moscow and closer to DC. Now you might be wondering, why? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but first and foremost is, we recognized back in the 60s, quite correctly, that China would be an emerging power on the global stage. This was unavoidable. This would always happen. So, instead of pushing them towards the asshole we don't like, we decided to suck it up for a bit and bring it towards us. Am I saying that we should go back to trade with China? Certainly not. What I am saying is we should be looking towards finding better trade deals and trade relations with nations and powers that still treat their people fairly and equally and rightly, but still don't compromise us economically. Because, yes, chips are expensive, and the labor market for chip production is, in turn, also very expensive. Because I can tell you right now, if I'm going to go into a factory for chip production, I'm asking at bare minimum what I'm getting paid now, and I'm already topped out at like $21, $23 an hour. $21.23, not $21 to $23. And that's fine. But self-production and trade aren't our only options either. And this kind of brings us towards our fourth point. What amount of work would need to go into actually building the things necessary for the production of various goods? Again, using chips as an example, the production of such a thing isn't as easy as pop it on in a conveyor belt and go. We kind of hit this point with the first one. Does anyone have the skill for this? Environmental conditions within a facility where chip production are absolutely vital too. In fact, if you have too much humidity, chip's gonna get fucked. If you have too much static electricity built up, chip's fried. It's not something you can just pop on a conveyor belt and go. You can't just like a car. It doesn't work that way. It requires some delicate procedures. And since the complexity of a chip can also play a huge part in its value and its production time, plus the knowledge and tools necessary, you're looking at an even tighter financial crush in a capitalist society where profit is necessary to some extent for producers in order to continue producing. Now, do they actually need that profit? That one's up for debate, and personally I'd have to say no. But that's not really the argument at hand right now. We can get into that in another episode, children. But this tighter crunch to get into production as soon as possible, and with the demand that isn't shrinking, by the way, computer chips ain't just suddenly disappearing and we don't need them no more. Yeah, we're gonna use poor grammar. You're gonna have to deal with it. But that demand is only gonna go up. In other words, you gotta get that production going quick if you want to meet that demand and keep meeting that demand without any interruption or rapid rise and increase in cost. Because it's fine, well, and good to want to reduce your trade, but by reducing that trade, you're reducing supply, and in order to keep that supply from being more expensive, you need to bolster it somehow. Unfortunately, the response, at least from the president, has been, well, we're gonna produce them ourselves. Okay. You gonna go about that in any particular way? You gonna incentivize people? You gonna find out whether or not we can do that immediately? You know, show me the money. This kind of brings us down to our culmination of a third point, and this one hits on when they go to the campaign trail, or when they want to oppose an issue. And that basically can be summarized as, fear-mongering is wrong, unless you're doing it for the, quote, right reasons. You might be wondering, Democrats fear-mongering? And believe it or not, they do. It's not uncommon or even surprising to see people like Fox OAN and other assholes like that chuck whatever the fear they got into the fire. But more often than not, what's much less cited, unless you're a Republican, is the fear tactics used by the Democratic Party. It's actually much more subtle if you don't know what to look for. But when you listen to the rhetoric of many of these individuals, it will and does poke its head out every so often. In fact, to help prove that point, we're going to pop open our email here and listen to this from a group called Our Revolution. Keep in mind, Our Revolution is a progressive group that started around the time Bernie Sanders launched his 2016 campaign. But here we read. The Republican primary for president is underway, and both the leading candidates are fascists open about wanting to crush workers' rights, end fair elections, slash environmental protections, take away reproductive freedom, and give even more power to billionaires and multinational corporations. Now, are these things facts? To some extent, yes, you can argue that a lot of these are facts, even all of these. However, it's the way they're presented that matters. Stopping whoever wins between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis is a top priority, because if either of them becomes president, we may never have another fair election or the opportunity to peacefully make progress. Now, as someone who's not on either side, this kind of gets a weird point, because it's like, well, what about other Republicans who might be running or might consider running? For example, former ambassador to the UN under the Trump administration, Nikki Haley. She's announced a presidential bid. Do we agree with her? Fuck no! Would I say she's a fascist? Based on her policy, not really. Definitely a traditional conservative, but a fascist, no. There's also another fella who's been seriously considering a run, and this fella we actually mentioned a few years back. Back during the whole George Floyd thing, actually. He was a man who presented an idea for a form of policing around the United States, and at the time we thought it was, well, an interesting and not terrible thought, but wouldn't do enough. And we even considered the possibility that it might have been his people in the Senate, every other Republican senator who is white, giving him this to propose. However, as time has led on, and as we've studied this man a little bit more, we've come to realize, no, this is his own actual idea, and he is actually giving an honest try. And he definitely ain't just blindly backing Trump or DeSantis constantly, because he's even seriously considered his own run. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, now who could this man be? That man is Tim Scott, the only black Republican senator. Tim Scott's also considering a run, and he actually has a very, very moderate platform from what we've seen. He actually wants to reach across the aisle, and he wants to make a more neutral ground. It seems like he actually has a very similar platform to another man who ran a couple of years back, named John Kasich. John Kasich being the former governor of Ohio and a largely moderate Republican. Someone who also sought to reach out across the aisle. In fact, in early 2020, there was mild speculation about John Hickenlooper, senator from Colorado, and John Kasich running on a joint ticket in a fusion party. Which actually probably wouldn't have been a bad idea. Probably wouldn't have been a great idea. Unfortunately, hyperpartisanship shot that hard as a motherfucker. And, well, that is why that is not a thing. But it goes to show that you're not only limited to both Trump or DeSantis. DeSantis hasn't even officially announced a run yet. And further, by only focusing on the two least desirable candidates, you're trying to paint a picture of the opposition being the worst possible image possible. This is a straw man. Look, we're not saying that there aren't Republicans that have some wild and crazy ideas, especially these two. Oh my God. What we are saying is that's not every Republican, just like not every Democrat is out there trying to push for literally every goddamn leftist cause there is. You have the ability to think outside the box. Or, if you want to borrow from Taco Bell, think outside the damn bun. Because, my God, y'all need it. It's insane. In addition to all this, many Democrats have taken up the notion of a with us or against us mentality, where anything less than loyalty to the totality of their ideas is essentially nothing more than supporting Republicans. And we have to ask, sincerely, isn't this exactly what Republicans are doing right now? Sure. Your causes are good. Your causes are noble. But what is your intention? Because if we ask Gautama Buddha, actions taken with impure intentions remain forever tainted by those intentions. We're paraphrasing the hell out of that, by the way. But that's the basic idea. Is your action pure? Or is it tainted by ill intention, i.e. the intention to get voters to vote for you? Now, we're not saying you don't have good goals. In fact, we agree with a lot of these goals. In fact, we want to push a lot of these goals further. We want to take it that step further. Going back to our first point, we don't believe you will. And we believe you only will if the intention is to gain more votes. And why do we say this? Because ask any Democrat back in 2012 what they thought of trans rights. And their feelings would have probably been unknown, neutral, or slightly negative. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been people on the Democratic side that would have been more positive and more open to the idea, nor am I saying that Republicans would have been more so. Because neither of those things are true. There were definitely people in support of trans rights that identified as Democratic, and there are definitely people in the Republican Party who hated trans rights of any kind. What we are saying is, yeah, it's great to want to stand up for these causes, and you like to stand up for these causes too, so long as they can win you votes. And essentially that leaves you, if you're an independent, with two choices. You can choose between Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World. We're not saying necessarily exactly those extremes, but if we're going back to the fear-mongering, it's not at all astonishing to conclude just that. Because you pretty much hear it all the freaking time. Except for the Brave New World part. A lot of Americans don't know what Brave New World is, and that's, quite frankly, really depressing. Because you really should if you don't. In fact, if you haven't read either of these books, read them. In short, if Dems want to appeal more to independence, something that approximately 40% of my state identifies as, fun fact about Colorado, they would be wise to drop this holier-than-thou attitude, open up to collaboration with third parties and unaffiliateds to actually see what they want, and maybe find a way to appeal to them, and push for a system that allows for a multi-party Congress instead of jockeying power back and forth, but with what they see as essentially Satan. Sorry. This, unfortunately for them, would mean surrendering a significant degree of power, and this is quite frankly something neither major political machine has even been remotely willing to let go of. Now you might say, hey, don't Democrats support ranked choice voting? Some. Not all, but some. It's definitely not a platform on the Democratic plank, or definitely not a plank on the Democratic platform. But there are a few. Definitely not enough to make it a party policy. And if they were true believers in it, they would change their primary system to one. So to put it simply, independents don't have to agree with you, and if you're an independent or unaffiliated like myself, please don't feel like you're compelled to have to choose between A or B, because you're not. You don't have to. You can also choose to pick a third party, pick a candidate within their primaries that's very different from their ideals, like the Tim Scott thing. Or, and this might be astonishing to hear, you also have the right to not vote. And while that might piss people off, and while that might antagonize them, it might give them fuel on the fire to believe that, hey, you're just making them win. Keep in mind, you're not. You are exercising your right to vote or not vote, just like any goddamn good, gut-free world nation would allow. You don't have to pick between a douche and a turd. You don't have to pick between 1984 and Brave New World. You don't have to pick between A, B, or C, or D even. In fact, if you listen to our Major Minor Mayhem episode, which was the season finale of season 2, you'll find that, hell, even the major parties don't commit to their own solid ideas, and they do borrow from third parties. Quite a bit. But again, you don't have to feel like it's your fault, because it's not independence. It is on the party to convey and promote their platform in an effective, concise manner. And when that platform doesn't line up, it is their duty to ensure that they either hold to their ideas or try to open up to other ideas and be more open to listening to those who otherwise wouldn't vote for them. Because how do you get votes? Do you punch down at people? Do you tell them they're stupid? Do you insult them? Do you tell them, hey, you're just essentially handing this to fascism? No. Because again, that's not an independent's job. It is the party's job to compel the independent to vote for the party. And if your party can't do that, well, that just makes you a bunch of assholes. If you happen to stick tuned to the end, thank you. We know this is a little unusual for us to rail on the Democratic Party, but quite frankly, if they're going to keep being assholes like this and they're going to keep throwing around internet memes like that, they're open game. And quite frankly, everyone's open game. Hell, throughout the rest of the season, we're going to be focusing on a lot more minor and third-party ideas. Why? Because you guys seem to like that. That seems to be where we get most of your listening, and that's where we seem to catch your interest the most. And we thank you for that. Because you are helping achieve the main goal of Mongoose Brigade. And that is to promote and open up the idea that you don't have to pick between A or B. And opening up our system to more ideas. Anyways, that's our show. If you like it, please hit the like. If you hate it all you want. Either way, go ahead and please share us. And we've noticed we got a few subscribers now. Thank you. We appreciate you subscribing, and we like to consider you honorary members of the brigade. And keep in mind, those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step. Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.